Hi, this is Titash from The Wire, and we're interviewing Nayanjot Lahiri today, who's just won the American History Association's prize for the best South Asian history book, Ashoka in Ancient India. Nayanjot Lahiri has previously written books on Harappa, Finding Forgotten Cities, and she's been teaching in DU, and this year she started teaching in Ashoka University. You were asked by the Harvard University Press's Sharmila Sen to write this book. So what did you envision at that point?
Well, as a matter of fact, when she asked me to write this book, her email just came all out of the blue, and I was in the midst of 4 years of administration in the University of Delhi. So I didn't immediately envision all the nitty-gritties, but I did think that knowing something about Ashoka, since I had been doing ancient India, as it were, for my working life. So I had imagined that this would be a book in the life and times genre. Mm-hmm. So I thought that I would be looking at Ashoka's life as a prince, as a ruler, as somebody who then got converted because of a huge trauma in his life, and then also filling up on those times beyond him, because whatever he may have or may not have said, how his ideas were received really depended on the nature of people around him, their views, how they looked at political authority and so on. So this is the way I looked at it, and I imagined it would also have a third part, which would be his afterlife. So the book was really thought of in 3 parts, which is his life, his times, and then his afterlife. As it so happened, of course, the book turned out very differently, because if you look at the book, the first part is really about his times, and that's because you cannot talk about Emperor Ashoka's life until he begins to speak, which is well into his reign. This is after the Battle of Kalinga. So if you have to reconstruct and imagine or envision his early years, you have to do it through textual sources which were put together and which remembered him many centuries after he passed away. Mm-hmm. So the scheme got actually fairly jumbled up, but that's how a lot of academic work happens, that you begin with a particular hypothesis, and as you go deep into your subject, it actually turns out to be something which is quite different. And much to my own surprise, and I would say later delight, I realized that there's a lot that could be said about Ashoka still, and it was very different from what I had thought I would be saying, or the manner in which I would be saying it.
Yeah, so it just developed a life of its own.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And you sort of preempted my second question, which was about the sources. So you've been using edicts and you've been using literary sources, but the literary sources are, as you said, from a later time.
Yeah.
So how have you been dealing with the interpolations and just separating, say, myth from reality? For instance, the Kalinga War, say, how much of that would you think would be myth, and how?
Actually the interesting thing is, as far as the Kalinga War is concerned, the only source which mentions the Kalinga War is Ashok's own edict. Mm-hmm. So he's speaking in his own voice. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, we don't have a problem in thinking about this as something which was concocted some mm-hmm. centuries later. If you look at the later sources, when they try to explain the change of heart of Ashoka, nobody talks about the Battle of Kalinga and the trauma that came with it. Something which was a big victory, objectively speaking, but which the emperor saw as a massive, defeat because of the collateral damage it caused. On the contrary, the literary sources look at the intervention, let's say, of a Buddhist, which is crucial in making Ashoka turn to that religion. So the Kalinga War, there's no issue of interpolations, but the point is that if you're looking at his early years as a prince, or even all the predictions that are made that he would become emperor, the challenge really is to use those sources, but not to use them as direct factual accounts of what, saying that this actually happened. So for me, the question was that if Ashoka is remembered many centuries after his time in this particular way, surely some elements would have been introduced which would make people believe this story. So, for example, an ajivika in the text is very important in predicting that the emperor would become, that this child who was still unborn would become the emperor of Jambudweep, as it were. The term India is obviously not used then. And if you look at Ashok's own inscriptions, he actually got several caves created for the Ajivikas in the Barabar Hills, and he got his inscriptions put there which mention that these are for the Ajivikas. So I felt that many centuries later, somebody who is reading this story which says that it was an Ajivika who predicted his greatness may well have believed it, because Ashoka himself is supposed to have been a major patron of the Ajivikas. So you teased out little facts and then tried to give them a certain kind of life, but it isn't as if I used those later sources as a kind of direct, for getting a direct insight into his life. That actually, the historical Ashoka only emerges from his own words.
So you've titled your first chapter The Apocryphal Life of Ashoka, and so you're basically just reconstructing Ashoka's life from these various sources. And so why do you think that he had this distinct appeal among so many rulers? Why did you turn to Ashoka just at this point?
Well, for one thing, anybody who does, a lot of people who've written on ancient India have written on Ashoka. So if you just look at the large number of books and papers that have been written on Ashoka, they would go into something like 2000 publications.
Yes.
So there is always an appeal that Ashoka has for scholars of ancient India. I think part of that has to do with the fact that we are always attracted to public figures that have an impact across large territories. So if you think of the empire of Ashoka, you're looking at an empire which stretched from Afghanistan to Andhra on the one hand, and from Gujarat to Odisha on the other hand. So it's a pretty large territory. I think part of the appeal of Ashoka has to do with the fact that he has been so important in the manner in which Indians in modern times have used symbols associated with him and his ideas. So, everyone is aware of Ashoka in India because of the Sarnath capital being the national symbol, for example. The fact that the Ashoka Chakra is there on our national flag. The fact that somebody like Nehru saw himself as the modern inheritor of the Ashokan political tradition, where he was actually going to become the first prime minister of a country which came out of a national movement that was very largely non-violent, not entirely. But I think the greatest appeal that Ashoka has for, at least he had for me, was that there was a way in which he spoke directly to his people. This is very, very rare. So, today you think of political leaders as communicators, but the pioneer in this, in the Indian case, happens to be this emperor. He's a communicator par excellence, a man who actually puts up his words in different parts of India and wants those words to be read out to his people. He keeps talking about his people listening to his message. It's quite amazing. Equally amazing is the nature of the messages. There's not a king who's talking about, he's not a dreadlord talking about taxes and, conscription in the army and so on and so forth. He's talking about, a public culture where every sect respects every other, where you actually don't praise your own religion in a way that it seems, impolite and detrimental to this larger culture of, different religious groups living together. A person who appeals to his people to regulate the castration of animals, to regulate the killing of living beings, who pleads with his people not to kill pregnant sows and she-goats. He has to do nothing else to appear absolutely extraordinary. So I think it's both the fact that he has been such an important figure in the life of India since antiquity in many ways, and also the nature of what he said.
Is that why you write that he was a reversal in the conception of kingship? At one point in your book you're saying, and how do you think,
what I meant by this was, this is how he presents himself. So usually if you think of all the big kings and rulers in any part of the world, after a military victory, there is a way in which that is glorified. And the only time when Emperor Ashoka talks about a military victory, he's actually presenting it as a moral defeat. And he talks about how he has to repent for all the people he has killed and enslaved and injured. So, he is, as it were, as I say in my book, he is, he's wringing out defeat from the jaws of victory. Usually, a great military victory is presented as a major moment in the life of a monarch. In this case also it's a major moment, but not for the reasons as it is in other instances.
As far as the debate about Ashok's edicts and his whole Dhamma being a political ideology, would you agree with that?
He was a political person.
As in with all the edicts and this basically the Dhamma ideology that he's been putting out and saying that you're not going to kill animals.
So if you're asking me, was it a sham?
I'm not
no.
saying it's a sham, I'm just
I really think he believed in it. And it also incidentally had a political purpose. At the same time, I don't think that, Dhamma was just entirely political. The kinds of things that he's talking about are not things which are usually important for political people. So he's talking about respecting your parents, showing liberality to Shramans and Brahmans, not actually accumulating more than is necessary. Frankly, when you think about political messaging, I don't think this is great political messaging. So I think Dhamma has to be seen in terms of political thought, not in terms of, that he's just has a kind of narrow political agenda. And then the question one has to try and answer is that, do you find this kind of political thought across periods and in different parts of the world? It's actually not very common. It's quite unusual.
This book was supposed to be for instance, Kumkum Roy has said that you've attempted to move beyond what is strictly academic, and you've succeeded remarkably. beyond dry academic narrative. And as B.D. Chattopadhyay has said, that you've broken the barrier between hard evidence and what would be considered biased, or by which he means imaginary. So, what would you say was your narrative strategy in, if I were to say put it, what was the craft of history writing that you employed in this?
The craft of history writing that I employed, it was twofold. First was to use all the tools that historians use. So if you are looking at sources which are not considered to be traditional hard evidence, you don't balk at it and you say, okay, what is it that I can tease out, and do it critically. So that was part of it. But the narrative strategy really came out of whatever I've read in literature. And I do think that it's important for scholars to speak in a way, to write in a way that, this large audience that we have in India who's deeply interested in history actually feels enthused by your narratives. And I have to say, in this, and I have to give him a lot of credit for this, my very, old friend and editor, Rukun Advani, was absolutely crucial. And this exercise of writing for a larger audience actually began with finding forgotten cities. So I discovered all these archival records and I put together a narrative and I sent the first draft to Rukun. And he sent it back with all kinds of markings on it. I've still got it because it should go to the archives. And he said, it's such a wonderful story and you cannot, tell this story in this dry academic way. And you have to, he said, just take a sabbatical from academic writing and read good literature and just look at how, novelists write and so on and so forth. So with his prodding and his faith that I could do it, it's not easy for academics to do it. I must say that, you
Yes.
have a history background, so you know exactly what sorts of narratives are produced. So I thought, what is there to lose? Why shouldn't I try to reinvent myself? So that narrative strategy, first came out of that book. And after that, I haven't been able to write in that dry academic way again. And for me, writing in this way is very important, this narrative strategy, because I am interested in a readership that is not confined to just history teachers and students. I like the idea that there are people who are interested in history, but who may be computer scientists or politicians or, people in industry who just feel happy reading well written stuff. And there are people like that. You think of somebody like Ram Guha and, the wonderfully lucid way that he writes in. So one doesn't even have to look outside India. And you have great historians who've written wonderful narratives. There are lots of people here who have been doing it for quite a while now.
I was wondering if we should talk about how Ashoka is relevant today.
As far as I'm concerned, Ashoka is still relevant, because as far as I see, and that's when, when people say that, the whole Kalinga thing was actually something that he just put out for all kinds of political reasons. I ask myself the question that we've seen so many pogroms, right? You've had huge massacres of people, whether it's 1984 or if you look at Gujarat. How many of our political leaders have had, this kind of self-reflexiveness to be out in the public domain and to say that, well, we are very sorry that this happened, during our watch. Because if you are the Prime Minister of India or if you are the Chief Minister of a particular state, and this happens at that point in time, regardless of your own culpability, it happens under your watch. So for me, Ashoka is still relevant because he's an example who's waiting to be followed in the Indian context.
And in terms of how he was important in nationalist historiography, he was propped up as one of those great centralizers. How has that dropped after independence? Do you think that the idea of Ashoka is slowly dissipating?
I don't think so. I think he's still very popular and in all kinds of ways. So if you look at the Bihar elections, when there was a build up to the Bihar elections, Ashoka was made out to be a Kushwaha. And it's really surprising because he doesn't mention his caste status anywhere. Caste doesn't matter to him, at all. So Ashoka continues to be very, very popular for all kinds of reasons, which, have nothing to do with what he said,
Yes.
but have to do with the way in which he is, appropriated by all kinds of people.
Yes, it's been a while since Shah Rukh Khan did Ashoka.
I know that's true, but that's a film, and those who criticize it, I think in the Indian context, the problem is that we tend to idealize all our historical figures, and you really shouldn't do that because history is very untidy. And when you're producing a film, it's an artistic work, and it's perfectly fine to do all kinds of things with historical narratives. It's not meant to be a documentary.
Thanks, Professor Lahiri, for talking to us, and congratulations for this very prestigious award. Thank you for watching.
Thank you very much.